Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me on the mic? Wonderful. Well, of those of you who don't know me, I am Gracie Lawson Borders, the Dean of your Kathy Hughes School of Communications, and we welcome you this afternoon to our Media Diversity panel. First of all, I want to make sure you know that this is a joint project between the Media Journalism and Film Department and the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. And so my welcome is going to be brief as I bring the director, John Sawyer, up to also welcome you. And then I'll come back and introduce you to our panelists. And what they're going to do is take about 10 minutes or so, tell you a little their background in connection to this very, very broad topic, which is diversity in media today and in the past. And so what we want you to know is we want you to listen, learn, ask questions, observe, add your input, because this is a topic that's been ongoing for a long time. For those of you who I haven't talked to here at the school, I am a former newspaper journalist, last at the Chicago Tribune. And this topic was on the table when I graduated from undergraduate, just like you, from Michigan State University in the 80s. We had this very same conversation. So some of us can talk to you about our memories, past, present, and current. But without further ado, welcome. We want you to enjoy this. I do want to thank Professor Ingrid Sturgis, she's somewhere around here, and Joan Woods and Ann Peters, who they were the impetus of getting us going today with the help of so many people from the Pulitzer Center and here in your Media Journalism and Film Department in the School of Communications. So we want to show that there's great appreciation for that, and I'm going to turn it over to John Sawyer and come back in a minute.
Thank you, Dean. I want to thank you all for coming, and especially to the students here at Howard. The Kathy Hughes School of Communication is one of the newest members of the Pulitzer Center Campus Consortium, and we couldn't be more pleased to have you part of this. The Pulitzer Center is first and foremost a journalism organization, raising money to support quality reporting on big systemic issues, big global issues, and working with our grantees to place the stories in the biggest possible outlets. And we're now doing nearly 120 professional journalism projects a year. But the other part of the Pulitzer Center, our educational outreach to K-12 schools and universities, is an increasingly important part of our work too. It's wonderful that so many of our stories appear in outlets like PBS NewsHour, The New Yorker, the New York Times, but what about all the people across the country who don't follow those outlets or who actively disdain those outlets, as the case may be? If we truly want to engage the broadest possible public in the big issues that affect us all, we have to go out and find people where they are. And what better place than in middle schools and high schools and great universities like Howard? We're now doing over 600 events like this one each year, reaching thousands of students via in-person journalism engagement and also through our online lesson builder, a curricular tool that's freely available to educators anywhere in the world. And lastly, very much speaking to the topic of today's discussion, we're not going to succeed in engaging the broad audiences we seek if we don't ensure that our journalists are as diverse as the publics we seek to serve. We have to do a better job at surfacing those voices. That's true for the Pulitzer Center. It's true for journalism in general. As the Dean just reminded us, this is not a new issue, but it's one that we urgently need to address. The journalism leaders on this panel are fully aware of the challenge, and they're working hard to be part of the solution. Now I want to invite Gracie back to introduce them and then to moderate the discussion that follows. Thanks again to you all, and I look forward to working with you on our student reporting fellowships and other events as we bring journalists here. And we have internships at the Pulitzer Center. There's lots of ways to be engaged with what we do. You can start by going to pulitzercenter.org, signing up for our newsletter. If you're tweeting about today's events, Jeff Barris, our communications director here, just told me that we're going to make this hashtag Pulitzer Howard. So share what you hear, share what these folks are going to tell you, and thanks again. Then after, once we'll let this run an hour plus or so, and then we'll have an opportunity to kind of meet and greet in the next room behind. So, thank you all, and with that, Tracy.
Thank you, John. So again, I'm going to mention that hashtag Pulitzer Howard. So we know, and I'm sure Professor Carswell has talked to you about, we want to stay as interactive as we can. So we mentioned before, this is not a new topic, but it's an important topic. And although there has been some progress in our country in attempting to diversify the media, with this being the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report upon us, we do get to look back and say, what have we done differently in 50 years and how we cover and who covers our communities across this country. And there are numbers we're going to throw at you today at different times, and we'll do that a little later. But first, I want to introduce you to the panel. And what they're going to do, we have a wonderful panel for you here today, so we definitely want to make sure students, you're asking good questions afterwards, is I'll introduce them by name, and each one of them are going to have a different perspective to share with you and as they speak. So when I introduce them, it is not in any specific order of their speaking, but I just want to make sure I get them before you, and then we'll get started. So first there in the center is Joy Chin, former anchor at Al Jazeera America and CBS News. Thank you for being here today. Terry Samuel, Deputy Managing Editor at NPR News. Thank you very much for being here. And we have Laura Zelenko, who is Head of Standards, Diversity, Talent, and Training for Bloomberg News. So we really want to give them a round of applause for thanking them for coming here to be with us today. And Terry, since you're at my immediate right, we're going to start with you.
That's why I sat here.
Okay.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for having us. And I know there's been some mention early on about how long this conversation has been going on. And I think that discussion is usually about how enthusiastic we should be and how demoralized we might be. But I have to tell you, it doesn't feel like that long ago when I was sitting in seats like this, trying to figure out, one, if I could get a job in journalism, two, whether I was any good at it, and three, whether it was something that was important enough that I would want to do with my life. And I have to tell you, it is exactly things like this that answered all of those questions for me. Yes, yes, yes. And so what I want to say about today is these people and the people sitting next to you and the people in this room, they have things to give you and things to offer, and you should take it. Because at the end of the day, I think what diversity is about, we often talk about it as something that's lacking and something that's desired and a problem to be solved. But what it is, when you're doing this work, is you want to tell stories. And what happens when you lack diversity is stories don't get told. Important stories get told inaccurately, in the wrong way, in exactly the wrong way sometimes. Yesterday, there was a big story in the news about the president calling a widow and having that go completely south in like the strangest way. You know, he said something and you listen to it, and because it's Donald Trump, you know, it turned into a big thing. But you can see how that can happen. And with somebody else, it may have been a different story. But you know what happened in newsrooms across the country for black editors and reporters? They had to manage the handling of the person who made the accusation. Black congresswoman attacking the president, and yes, it turned into a he said, she said, Democrat versus Republican thing. But there were conversations, and I heard it, well, she's not a credible witness. She's not a credible observer. And you just have to say, you know, that's not what the story's about. The story's about the president interacting with a certain segment of America and what that meant. So in any case, you realize that the work comes down to really granular stuff. And part of what you have to do is figure out what it is that you want to do, the stories you want to tell, and find people who are doing it and steal it from them. The best advice I ever got about how to do journalism was Les Payne, who used to be at Newsday, international editor, editorial page editor, and he used to sit next to a guy who I used to read. And he said that he learned how to do this by just stealing the way this guy wrote, the way he talked on the phone. He said he'd just sit there and listen and steal it. And there is a direct line from Les Payne sitting in that bar telling me that, and me sitting here talking to you about what you guys are going to do. And that's how we solve this problem. One story at a time that you do, that I edit, that Les managed when he was doing it. And so I want to say, you know, that story about be the change you want to see, you are.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you. Thank you. We'll move on to Joanna.
I don't even know that I can be as thoughtful as Terry.
It's easy.
I hope. I like to say that I came from working last year at the greatest experiment that we've had in media in recent years. It was Jazeera America. Did any of you all ever watch our programming? It's okay if you say no, because literally millions of other people said no. Literally millions of other people said no. But that's all right. I think we were part of the grandest experiment in major media this country has seen, and I'm very proud of that. And I want to make a particular point of addressing something that we did that I think other news organizations could learn from in this country. Because we were a new organization, we had no template for how things would be done, who should manage, what sort of stories would be done, where we would put our investments. And so that gave us both a great opportunity and enormous responsibility. And I think we met that very well. We were a news organization run by, as I like to refer to her, a grown-up woman. But because we were an organization run by a grown-up woman, not by the traditional figures who I'd worked for at CBS and CNN before that, we had the opportunity to lay out a whole management structure that was guided by people who don't normally get to be in those roles. And Al Jazeera did that, not only having a woman in charge, but having a number of women and people of color and some conservative thinkers, I mean, across a political spectrum as well. People of different faiths. I really think that it was the first place I'd ever worked with that much diversity in our structure, but also all the way up and down our ladder. So my particular show was staffed by 55 people, and I've never worked with that great a variety of people with different interests, with different approaches, age groups. This was an extraordinary thing, and where this matters is it changes your coverage. It changes what kinds of stories you tell. It changes what voices you reach out to. It changes your thinking about, how do I look at that story? Is that story about what the president did or didn't say to a widow? Or is that story, at what point is that driven by what people are trying to suggest about it, the individual who made the accusations? We would have approached any of those stories in a completely different way, I think, than our peer colleagues in television. And we did routinely do stories that were not seen in other places, although it's interesting now that, 2 years later, I actually see more people covering stories than we did 3 years ago, but that's okay. But, I think about this, the kinds of stories we were doing. We looked at Mike Brown's death and said, where's the echo of Emmett Till in that? I don't think I would have done that on the CBS Evening News. We looked at, did you know, I didn't know this before I did this story, that in the United States there is a previous history of rounding up people of Mexican descent even those who are U.S. born and U.S. citizens, and forcing them into Mexico. There was actually, this happened before. This happened before. This is not reported in other parts of the mainstream news media, right? So this was coverage that we could do. We did more stories on Native communities, First Nations communities, than I had ever seen done. And I'd worked for CBS, and I'd worked for CNN, and these are relatively progressive environments in the media. But I had never done that kind of coverage until we had the opportunity to do that at Al Jazeera. So what I say is, you know, I know that when I started at CNN, I was invited to join our diversity committee. And the conversation primarily surrounded, well, diversity, this is really a cool way to get more viewers. I mean, it's completely, you know, mercenary, the approach that they took. But it was business. How do we grow a new audience of viewers? Well, maybe we'll do different kind of coverage. Maybe we'll see different faces. I think there are multiple ways you can look at it, but I think that the important thing about driving audiences isn't just what faces you're seeing on camera. It's across the board. I think you have to have, we have to create a pipeline for diverse managers of newsrooms, diverse editors of newsrooms. And I mean diverse in every way. I really do mean that this goes beyond racial identity or ethnicity or anything else. I do mean political identity as well. I do mean faith-based identity as well. I think that this is what actually changes the media. And I believe that your generation will be part of that. Hopefully you won't have to have the same discussions that we're having now when you've been in this business for 30 years, but I'd like to believe that that is the change that you will make.
Thank you. Thank you, Joey. Thank you very much. And now we will continue adding to that conversation with Laura from Bloomberg.
So thank you very much for having me, and I'm really honored to be part of this conversation. And as my 16-year-old daughter said to me last night, as she insisted that I fully understood the term woke, which she had to explain to me at length. I think I'm here to learn as much from you as I am here to give you information about myself and about Bloomberg. For those of you who don't know Bloomberg, we have 2,700 journalists and analysts around the world in bureaus in 120 countries. I have been with Bloomberg for 24 years. I started as a journalist in Prague, where we had no one in Eastern Europe at the time. I helped open all the bureaus in Eastern Europe and Russia, and ran our coverage in Latin America, and ran lots of different coverage over the years until my most recent job was to manage about more than 600 journalists covering all of our business and finance stories. In July of this year, my boss, who's the editor-in-chief, said that he wanted to create a position that was senior, that was reporting into him, to try to push more aggressively our diversity initiatives. I mean, over the time that I've been at Bloomberg, we've made a lot of progress, but like most news organizations in the U.S., we're stuck. And we're stuck in a way that there hadn't been a lot of creative thought put into what we can do differently. So he said this, but he wasn't quite sure how to structure the job because he didn't want the job to just be diversity. And I suggested that we combine those efforts with a group that we already had in place that was responsible for our standards, our training, and all of our talent recruitment. And so my job in this area is looking at diversity not just in terms of the very important initiatives surrounding building a more diverse workforce, which we, I think, have understand why that's so important, but also in terms of our sourcing and stories, in terms of making sure that we're actually intentionally trying to track and pay attention to who we're quoting in stories, who we're putting on TV, who's sitting behind the, who are the anchors, that we're looking at diversity in the newsroom as well as every layer of management, that we're going team by team, bureau by bureau, coverage area by coverage area, to make sure that that the managers are accountable for understanding the importance of this initiative. And it's also about our coverage of diversity in all the companies that we report on. So we actually have a team called Managing Diversity, and their job is to look at the challenges that companies are facing in dealing with these issues. And I think one thing that we've realized, because we try to write very tough stories on the banking industry, on the tech industry, on Hollywood, and all the challenges that they're facing. And if we as a newsroom are not also actively trying to improve the diversity in our newsroom and being as bringing in as many diverse voices as we can, then we're a little bit hypocritical. So I think we are approaching this from all of those areas. I'm new to this particular role, so I do have a lot to learn, and I'm really interested in the questions that you have. I would say that one of the biggest challenges we have now is the fact that a lot of our newsroom isn't trained in some of the newest media strategies. We have extraordinary technology at Bloomberg, but not all of the journalists. I would say the majority of the journalists don't know how to tell stories on different platforms. They're mostly writers, and so it's very important for us to develop new training and to bring in lots more younger people who can help with that. And I would say we're also struggling a bit with how we're pipelining a more diverse workforce, because companies tend to go back to the same sources and go back to the same programs that we're involved in. So Bloomberg is itself getting involved in a lot of different schools in the United States, but also overseas, and teaching business journalism, working with students, and trying to find new ways to bring, looking for new ways to find the most talented and diverse talent. So it's a challenge. It's difficult, and I know that these questions have been around for years and years and years. And I think that my view on it is there's been a lot of progress. We are stuck. We need new ideas. We need new ways of trying to address this, because I look at my kids. I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, and I feel like I don't want them to be having this conversation at this level when they're my age. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank all the panelists. So I think if I could summarize real quickly something that the panelists said that we need to think about, and I want to throw the floor open, but not without doing my public service announcement, hashtag Pulitzer Howard. This is what we do in the age of digital media. That's important because we need to share these stories. So one of the things we had here, if we listen to Terry when he says reaching out to others, mentoring, identifying someone whose work you can relate to and you can grow from, you can learn from, is very important. Joey is right on point when she said what they got to do at Al Jazeera and the type of people who were working there and the types of stories that they were tackling. And one of the things we learned from this last election season, that there were a lot of people who said, we have voices, we have stories, why aren't you talking to us? And so we're looking at you, as I wrap up with what Laura said, is you're a part of the future. You're the ones that we want to be up here in 10, 20, 30 years with your experience and expertise, sharing and telling us what we've done differently, what we learned, what we're reaching out, and what we're doing. So this is the fun part where we throw the door open for you to ask questions and help us take this conversation, and more than just a conversation, but about you and what things you look at and the things you think about coverage and why all of this is important, that we help people understand that our country is filled with people with all kinds of different stories that need to be told and understood. And if we want a difference, we are going to have to be the change we want to see. I knew I was going to get that in there. All right, I open the floor. Yes, we got one up front and then I got one in the back.
Okay, so I definitely applaud your efforts for diversity and inclusion within the media. But I wanted to ask, I heard from you as far as like what your personal initiative is in terms of doing that. Like, I'm an associate producer at National Geographic. When I first got there, there were no other producers, no other black people there working in that capacity. So when I started speaking to the head of the digital department about how we can do diversity, he kept saying, I want to have more diversity. so I started speaking to him about it, and his recruitment efforts was pretty much at American University. He wasn't even aware of Howard, at a point. He was just like, well, I'm like, dude, I ran down a list of all the people who graduated from this university. And so I personally didn't graduate from here, but I tried to connect him with some people here, and I don't know how that conversation ended up going, but it's really, you kind of have to be ballsy in a way to get in those offices of those executives and talk to them and really connect the dots for them, because a lot of them go into these positions and they're going to go to where, I think you said earlier, where they're comfortable with, where they're used to going. They're going to Georgetown. They're going to where they know their inner circle is coming from. So their friends, their families have people in these positions. But it takes somebody to actually step into those offices and say something. It's not enough to just sit there and see it and want it and then not make the effort to go do it. So I heard from you, but I just wanted to hear from you too. What were you doing in terms of personally going into those offices and saying, hey, let's get some interns from these specific universities?
And you know that all of our interns were from Howard, actually.
Yes, she did a very good job recruiting from Howard.
But here's, I'll spin that on its head just a little bit to say this. Sometimes I look at that and I say, I had to fight through this, right? I'm old. I got into the business when people like me. The one person there was before me was Connie Chung. So I'm old enough that, and she's too old for you to even know who she is, right?
Thank you.
And so I know, and I look around. I've worked in big media organizations where that's exactly right. You go to the people you know. You go to the schools you know. You call up somebody you know. And so the next person, when I worked at CBS, I was always struck by the number of people with the same names, different generations. Just saying. I was always struck by that. And I understand that's the way they do that. I think today we have more platforms and more ways to go, and I think that's an advantage. I mean, the Al Jazeera experiment notwithstanding, I think there are many more opportunities to do that. I think it does take some ballsiness to get in there and say, you know what, we need to do that. Or you need to be an organization that is forward-thinking enough to say, that market's already been cornered. Maybe we'll go out and look for a different market. You can do it in a completely mercenary way. You can say, look, this is an audience not being reached. We can do it with this. So those things are true. And I also think that sometimes I don't mind that everybody was hired because they know somebody there. Because when I look for people, I'm going to call my network, and they're going to be my people. And that is exactly what we do, right? That's exactly, because the only way you can do that is to bring up the next generation, and the only way you can do that is to reach out and say, okay, you know what? I understand you got your pool of people. I've got my pool of people too, and I'm going to take advantage of everybody I know in my pool to bring up a new generation of different journalists.
Terry?
So you did the right thing. And importantly, you were in the room that you could go into the office. And I think that's where it starts. Everybody has got a responsibility. I mean, once you acknowledge that that's how it works, when there's a job opening, somebody picks up the phone and calls somebody they know, and they say, who do you know? And if you're me, you better have that list ready. Actually, if you're me, you don't wait for them to make that phone call. You go. When that job comes open, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The thing that I think managers have to acknowledge is that they're working, that they're not being, it's not merit. It's a network. And you can't allow your network to be narrow when what you're trying to do is tell stories. You have a responsibility not just to like the audience, which I know we love to talk about, but in this business, it's bigger than that. I used to work at the Washington Post, and I know it sounds corny, but it really is about the country and who we are. Part of the problem, part of the failure recently is that nobody thinks like an American anymore. It's my bubble, your bubble, and nobody is forcing a conversation among bunches of people. And I think that is in part a media failing. We're not telling stories that are common to all of us. It used to be that if you were, people, here are the stories people would tell. My grandfather came here from Russia with $2 in his pocket. And then the guy in Chicago would say, my grandfather came here from Alabama with nothing on his back. And there were two different narratives, very American at their core. We don't talk like that anymore. We do not talk like that anymore. It's like right, left, black, white. And it's always been a tough and ugly conversation. And we have a responsibility to like engage in that. And we can't engage in that if everybody's not in the room. And the way to get everybody in the room is media. That's the way we've always done it. So what I was saying about, I mean, part of what we do is traffic in information. Part of the reason we're stuck is because people don't know that we're looking for people to fill these jobs, and we are not looking for people other than just a small pool. Part of what this is about, and I know this is certainly what Pulitzer is about right now, is trying to kind of let everybody know. The advantage we have now is there is social media. Talk about, when I got out of college, all I wanted to figure out how to do is write well enough so I could get a newspaper job. You didn't hear, it was probably not terrifying to you, but what she said was, there are a bunch of people in the room and all they can do is write. And I was like, oh my God.
I know, I mean, it's all I can do, but I mean, it is a great skill. It's just that it's not enough anymore.
But let me tell you the advantage you have. What happened when we started this thing? Somebody said, what's the hashtag? And they asked him, and he said, Pulitzer Howard. I bet if they asked somebody at the back of the room, they might have said, Howard Pulitzer. Take your advantages where you can get them.
I could just add one thing.
Yes, Laura.
From the management point of view, it's always about bringing in the best people. But once you get them in, we have to make sure that people are fulfilled, challenged, and that we retain the best talent.
Stay,
and
yeah.
they want to stay. And so in addition to us looking for new places to find the people that we know are out there that we want to bring in, we need to do a better job in training. We need to do a better job with paying attention to the folks that we bring in, especially in the first couple of years, and not just giving them jobs that they're in the corner somewhere and you never hear from them again. They don't become famous in any way. They don't get any of the big assignments and that sort of thing. And we've been talking a lot about that as well, because it's the first 2 or 4 years tend to be, it's either someone falls in love with a place and wants to stay, or they're out the door, and then you're back where you started. So we are putting a lot more attention also into mentoring, training, what kind of assignments we're actually giving people. Are we coming back and talking to them, making sure they're fulfilled, making sure that they're challenged?
Thank you. There was a question in the back. I think I saw your hand. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mary Gonzalez. I am a junior journalism major and an American Studies minor. My question is for all the panelists about diversity. So we talk about diversity and how important it is to have diverse news or diverse people or people of color in the newsroom. My question is, when I say we, do hiring managers, because I was recently paying attention to the Jamil Hill story and what she can and cannot say. Do hiring managers or newsrooms or news companies, do they really want diversity, or do they just want Black people and Asian people and Hispanics in the newsroom to say they have diversity?
You go ahead.
I think it's true that I think it's true what you're alluding to, that sometimes it's just for show, right? It's just we're just trying to tick off some boxes. I don't dispute that at all. I think that there's resistance. I was telling Joan, I think, a story the other day about this, that I worked for a network, which I will not name, but you know which ones I worked for. So it's one of them. I worked for a network that that said that it valued my identity there, right? So I came in with a story, and this was my story. It was about bone marrow and the need to recruit people of color to give bone marrow, because you can't, apparently it works better if you have genetic similarities. So there was a big campaign underway at that moment for a particular patient. There was a kid, and they were trying to do all this stuff. And so I wanted to do this story. And so I went to my manager and I said, hey, I'm going to pitch for this particular program a story about this community getting together, trying to recruit minority donors of bone marrow, I'm like, I'm into this. I think this is a great story idea. It makes perfectly good sense to me. And she looked straight at me and said, you know, that show doesn't do black stories. And that's this century, by the way. And I sort of stopped up and I thought about this, and I've been thinking about this a lot again now, and I think in her mind, she was actually being kind to me. In her mind, she was saying, because when you're a network news correspondent, your currency is how many times you get on TV. And what she was saying is, if you go with this story to that executive producer and say, hey, I want to do this story, that's going to be seen as a story that he's not going to want on the air. Now, it could have been a story about space or farming or something else, but it happened to be a story which she categorized as black story. And you're not going to get on TV with that. And so that actually hurts you, because you won't be on TV. You'll miss an opportunity to be on TV, and you'll be pegged in this way. You're the person that pitched a black story. All right? So I think it's absolutely true that there's resistance, that there's, particularly in legacy media, there's a resistance to opening up in that way. That having been said, there are other opportunities, and it doesn't mean that you can back down on them. When you go somewhere else and you pitch it somewhere else, or you do something else with a story, you take another idea. I don't think you can lie down, and I think that's what Jamel's experience was. She didn't lie down on that. She was like, okay, well, I'm still out here, and I'm going to say something else. And you all, come get me and suspend me or do whatever you're going to do. I think people do have to have the courage to stand up and do that. It will not always be well received. It will also, in certain environments, put you at risk of being shoved over into the corner and identified as woman with a problem, too many black stories, or whatever it is. It will stigmatize you in a certain way in certain organizations. I'd be lying if I told you that that wasn't true. I think that does happen.
So let me take a crack at it, because I think actually Jamel is actually not the best example of the box checking, because everybody recognized how amazing she is, and I think this particular case illustrates a different media problem, which is these are not the bravest people in the world, media executives, especially TV media executives. So when Jamel said what she said the first time, she terrified them. When she said something a second time, she terrified them even more, and they didn't know what to do. It is a difficult conversation, and the country's having it, and ESPN doesn't know what to do with it. We've seen it more than one time, not just with Jamel. How many people got fired for saying difficult things? I think, though, the black story versus people, I bet if you talk to that producer, it will be about news judgment and what is news, and it's entirely subjective, and it's their version of the news, and you don't have to change the idea. What you have to do is change the person in the seat, eventually.
I mean, look, I think that all types of diversity are going to help a newsroom's reporting, and you can define, as we know, you can define diversity in so many different ways. But one reason why it seems like there's a checkbox is there are certain populations that we can actually measure and that actually make a difference. And I feel like when this issue comes up, that it's somewhat of a cop-out to say, okay, we're not gonna try to get more women now. We're not gonna try to get more black journalists now. It's just, we just want diversity. So let's just, and what you find in the newsroom, I mean, for the first time ever, and I've been at Bloomberg 24 years, for the first time ever, I was in a meeting of senior managers last week where I could feel the difference because we had a real significant number of women in those positions. So like suddenly the conversation felt different. I don't know how to explain it. It was just, it was more dynamic. I mean, I could feel a change. I was at one point the only senior woman at that level, and now there's 7. And you could really feel a difference. And I also, I had a conversation today with a black journalist in London who's our top, she's an executive editor at Bloomberg. And she said, I just want to check again. I'm going to stand. And she stood up in the newsroom and said, I just want to make sure that I'm the only black person in this room. Yeah, I am the only black person. And you know, for her, it's like, who's my mentor here? There's no one I can look up to. And there is just something about the numbers and the fact that it's just, to me, it's sinful that we can't get to the place that we need to be in these categories that are easy to measure, let alone the other categories. That's just how I look at it.
So the business about making people comfortable and making sure they don't leave and that whole thing and creating a pipeline, and we hire a lot of people at the lower levels, but the management, it comes down to one simple thing. If you work at a place, you have to feel like you belong there, that part of it is yours, that you want to get up and go to work, and part of it is what that woman in London said. Is this my place when I'm the only black person here?
But then how do you change it? You know, it's like that was going back to my original point of you go into these places, like you said, you couldn't even pitch a story that was considered.
I don't work there anymore.
It's like, true, but it's still
you know.
kind of like, even though in front of the camera, I guess there's more diversity, it's still the good old boys network behind the scenes.
And I think one of the things that's important, I see a question down front. I got 2 questions down front, and I saw one in the back, so I'll get you. But I think there's another thing that you said, Terry, and it's taking advantage of opportunities. And you do have to take advantage of opportunities, and you do have to pitch the stories, and you do have to take the risk. Or my little small example in, Oakland County, Michigan, and I said, we're not covering anything, relating to the rich, culture here, that there are people in Pontiac, Michigan, which is north of Detroit, and we need to do this. And then they said, okay, you do it. And so as I look at you, you also have to be ready to do it. So I had to say, guess I better do it, because someone responded to me. So you have to be prepared for that too. And that's what your professors and the people you're going to network later from this panel and around this room will be with us, is you're going to have to do your homework, know your craft, so you can be ready to pitch those other stories. And you can be ready to help people identify other people who can be in these roles in management and decision making and those types of things, because you just don't get to sit still. And you have to stay engaged and you have to push. So I want to throw it through the 2 questions up front, and then I've got one in the back.
Hello, my name is Nancy Gu. I'm a freshman journalism major from PG County, Maryland. I think it's really imperative as journalists that we pay attention to who's narrating the story that we're covering, to be sure that our own biases don't skew the story towards a certain angle. So from your own experience, how do you know that a story was yours to cover or to tell?
So do you get ownership of something if you?
Let me state an example so that
Okay.
from what I've seen on the news, a white man covering, let's say, if I were the Philando Castillo getting shot by a police officer is definitely different than a black man covering the story. So how do you know that story is yours to tell or to cover, to be sure that your own biases don't get in the way of what you're trying to report?
That's got to be on you. That's got to be on you to remind yourself of. I think probably the problem is that most people aren't. But, you know, owning it is, it's an assignment, so it's an assignment, right? But, I mean, a case like that would be an assignment. I do a thing, did any of you do J-Camp high school programs? So, okay, so you've heard my shtick before that. So it does. I do believe, Nancy, that it does make a difference who you are, what you bring to the story. I believe that if I walk into a room, and the example I always use is when I worked in Atlanta, there was a period where in the black community there were a number of Korean grocers. And there was friction, the community and the store owners. And so I asked that question, you know, what do you do? Should this reporter, and then there was a shooting and things went bad, should the reporter assigned to that story be Asian person who maybe will identify with the Korean grocer? Or should it be the black reporter? Or maybe it actually should be the white man in that case because he would be portrayed as neutral. Not necessarily because of his own biases, but because of the perceived biases that just seeing his face on TV. Is that different if you see my face and I'm talking to the Korean grocer and I'm going out in the black community? Does it imply something to the audience that she has sympathies to A or B? But that's like internal awareness about what your identity brings to that. There are times that I think it is actually incumbent upon reporters to stand up and say that, like, yo, maybe this is not the story I should be doing. At my first reporting job, I was in a big Navy town, Charleston, South Carolina, and I got sent to Pearl Harbor Day, so I got to go interview veterans who had survived Pearl Harbor. It did not go really well. Because they spent a lot of time telling me about the beady-eyed Japs that came after them. And I said, yeah, that's only half of my heritage. I'm not responsible for that entire incident, by the way. But I think, you know, so my feeling was, I was assigned that story, I took the story, I went out and did the story. It was ugly and uncomfortable. But maybe it was incumbent upon me to say to my boss, excuse me, maybe I am not the best person for Pearl Harbor Day with the number of veterans who got it. But, you know, maybe that was incumbent upon me to look at myself and see, could I do that right?
And maybe it was not the right time to do it
Yeah,
starting out. You could do that story now, no problem.
yeah. But wouldn't it make a difference?
So I was about to say, there's this weird thing in this business. You talk about your story to tell, and I tell people to do that. Find things that you can do that literally nobody else can do. That is your story. At the same time, I think the real joy in this kind of work is finding stories and actually letting people tell their own stories. That's what's missing. We don't let people talk who should be talking. And it takes a long time to figure out, I really have no stake in this. I mean, when people are shot and there's conflict, it's a much higher bar. But we tell a lot of stories that we're just not talking to enough people. You know, we're going out and we're getting, 30 seconds of tape so we could do 3.5 minutes. And, once we have it, we're done. But we actually haven't told the story because we didn't go far enough. And that's, I mean, some people would, it's biased, yes, but mostly what it is really terrible journalism.
And I think Terry hits a point that you brought up, Laura. We also have to work, as you guys are preparing and getting out there, we have to work at diversifying our sources as well. We can't go to the same doctor. We can't go to the same store owner. We can't go to the same. We have to push and be creative in making sure we get those stories told by people, to making sure we're talking to other people. So I've got a question here, and then I remember right back in the back there, and then I'll get you in.
Hello, my name is Maya McCullum. I'm a journalism major, playwriting minor from Atlanta, Georgia. My question was more so like as editors and like higher up in the journalism seat, how do you check around and make sure that they're still being diverse up there, even if you're the only one right there? For example, I know back home we were watching the news one night and it was like all the white stories are in and then all the black stories are in. And there was no combination. And so how do you as an editor know to check yourself and then check what's being put out so that it reflects possibly diversity inside of the organization that you're a part of?
I'll go quickly. It's hard, and you have to make it a priority. And when things come in that, especially if you're not 5 minutes away from deadline, it's like, guy. I heard an editor say, I didn't even have to do this, it was great. I heard a guy say and this was Puerto Rico coverage, because one of the hurricanes, he's like, there are no women in the story. It's like, okay, I don't have to do anything. You have to make people really aware, and at NPR, it's especially pronounced for me because I'm new to the whole audio thing, but all the voices were men, so that story went back where it came from, and it came back a lot better. And the second thing is, the whole black story, white story thing. During the recent healthcare debate where it failed in the Senate, and the big question was what to do next. Well, we interviewed the president of Kaiser. That's all we did. We didn't say anything about his race. We didn't say anything about how he got there. He's just a 57-year-old black guy who is obviously a 57-year-old black guy whose expertise was healthcare. Now, is that a black story? I hope not.
It was a healthcare story. And you do want to make sure that you have your voice, know who you are, know what your interest is, know what your passion is. I think they will all share this with you. But you also have to make sure in any newsroom that people know that you can cover any story, anytime and anywhere. It gets back to the professors' faces that I see in this room who are telling you constantly they want you to know your craft so that you can turn around and show people that you can do it. I've got a question back there in the cream, and then I'm going to get you. Okay. Yep, you. Hi, Cynthia.
I just want to ask, I've met two people in the media that had exposed the truth, and somehow the company that they work for never backed them up. So now they're blackballed in the system, and they can never work for any TV station. What I wanted to get at is that how is your company protecting their own journalists on, not to be, retaliated when they expose the truth? I think it's so important for the students to know that you guys got their back when they want to do a story.
I can start with that. I mean, part of my job is as the standards editor. We have very strict standards of on fairness and balance, and we have lawyers that review really tough stories. And when there's a complaint, part of my job is to be to make a decision of if we can't.
referee?
The referee. Yeah, the referee to decide if we can't resolve it. But I mean, as a news organization, the journalists are expected to be fair and balanced, and we want to do as hard-hitting stories as we can, and we will stick behind them. I mean, we do sometimes get sued, but we have reviewed these stories legally, and that's part of our responsibility. And I think we make it really clear to everyone who works for us that what we expect of you is to be factual first, balanced. If you're making an accusation against someone in the story, that you try to get their response, you try very hard to get their response. That that if you're saying something that could be potentially libelous, that we've had a lawyer review that. So we have very strict guidelines. But once the story is published, if we're we definitely stand behind the reporters. And if something is wrong, if it turns out we made a mistake, our policy is that we correct it as fast as possible.
I think that's generally true in the major media. I don't, so I've actually witnessed a couple of big ones. I worked at CBS when Dan Rather was the anchor, and then when Dan Rather wasn't the anchor.
And something happened in between.
Something happened in between, but in terms of, that was they stood behind him, then they reevaluated it, they looked at it, and they said, and even though he was the most valuable commodity they had, he went away. Because they felt that his journalism wasn't up to par. So of the various things I think that organization isn't good at, I would say that in terms of standing behind their people and then being willing to look in carefully and correct things that need to be corrected, I don't think that's usually...
That should be an industry standard.
Right. Or maybe you don't want to work for an organization that
Doesn't
is
do that.
not going to stand up for the people.
And I agree with, I would say that by the time something gets published or broadcast, it is not just the reporter's work anymore. That is that's the entire organization. And for the most part, unless you've done something really nefarious, we're all in it together.
And that's important too in what organizations you choose to work for and making sure you see what they do. I have a small little story like that in Akron, Ohio, where the chair of the media journalism and film department grew up, where I published a story when a middle school student robbed his middle school class and stole the substitute teacher's car and led them on a speed chase to Canton, Ohio. And I went to the police chief, and that was back in the day before progressive lenses where I could read upside down, and I got the kid's name. And the paper, a former Night Reader paper, agreed to publish the kid's name. And some people in the community started writing letters that I was a child hater because I, da-da-da-da. But the paper stood by me. And so for me and my contemporaries in the newsroom knew that I had taken that to our standards, had taken it to our attorneys. We agreed I had it. I confirmed it. I made sure what I told you, know your craft, know your facts, know your values. And so I was supported in the decision that the publication had agreed to make. And then it truly was all of our stories. And so even though those letters came in, I wasn't alone. And I throw this example out here because part of what we're sharing with you today too is it never stops. You have work. And one of the things you have to do is you have to be committed to accuracy, knowing news values, getting the facts right, being able to make sure your organization can stick with you, and holding it accountable when it doesn't. It's not easy. So what I'm going to do, I've got another question back there. I'm watching the time purposely because one of the things we want to do this afternoon is network with you. And so we have a reception in the back for you. So we're going to take your question, and then we'll have an opportunity with a very talented and a very experienced panel and others in the audience where we can kind of talk one-on-one. Okay, so go.
Hi, my name is Noni Marshall. I'm a junior broadcast journalism major from Nashville, Tennessee. My question is mostly for Laura. I know you were talking about how Bloomberg has had that experience with a black woman who said, "I'm the only one in the room." And I want to know, what is that disconnect? Is it that black people are replying? Is it that that Bloomberg isn't reaching out? Like, what is that disconnect? And then I also wanted to know about specific initiatives that you guys have to make sure that not only that you're getting those diverse people in the room, but that there's also upward mobility available for them. So
She's got a job.
I'm a reporter for 10 years, but I'm ready to move up. So is there like a process that is set up so that there can, eventually be that diversity in the management positions as well?
So I would say this is like the main part of my job right now. It's like my biggest challenge. And I just want to be really clear about this. That story that I told was of London. We've got lots of newsrooms around, so it's not like in the whole world, but it's horrible, and and I think it is really important. She's someone I work with very closely. She's out doing these kind of panels as well. She's very committed to helping us find the most talented, diverse journalists out there. And I think that from what I've seen so far in this role, I think we've done a pretty good job, like through our internship program, to bring people in. I just don't think we're looking hard enough. I don't think that we're being creative enough. And so I've set a challenge to the group. It's like, this just has to get better, and it has to get better now. And I'm sure that we haven't thought of all the possible schools or all the possible outlets that we could be turning to. And I don't know if, I really don't know the numbers. I don't know if we're getting applications or we're not getting applications, or we're not advertising the right place. But it's slow, but it is definitely improving year after year, but it's just not where we want it to be. I think that
She had a great idea for you,
I
though,
know,
to
but-
try to build
Yeah.
an internal network to raise people.
You know,
up.
so again, so what we're looking at is, once, we've done a lot of things already this year where we've created these reporter advisory boards, which are some of our senior reporters, to start mentoring some of the younger journalists. And one really good example of this is we have a reporter, a person of color who covers managing diversity, actually, and she was partnered up with a very experienced writer who worked with her on a story that got a lot of attention. It got her on TV. It got her some exposure on PBS, actually, also. And so one thing that we found is if we pair up the lesser experienced journalists with some of the more experienced journalists, it may help them get more exposure, become a little bit more visible within the organization, so that there's a path. And the other thing that we need to do more is just have these conversations where we're talking about your career. Like I said, I've seen so many people leave because they felt sort of like they were forgotten. And it is a big organization, and it's hard to do this, but I think you just have to be more intentional about this. If we care about this so much, we have to be more intentional, and we have to make sure that the managers, that this isn't something that we're saying, you need to do this, otherwise, it has to be like everyone realizes why it's important and that they're held accountable, because it's important it's going to make better coverage, it's going to make everyone look better, because we're going to have better stories, we're going to have, so that's, and it's a big hill to climb. I don't know why we're at the same, that we're still talking about this, but it's still a big hill to climb, but I'm still at a very optimistic phase of my job.
Can I say two things? But what you heard is how newsrooms work all the time. People with experience helping people without experience. And so when I tell you, if there's not a program in place for that, you go find the person who's doing the thing that you want to do,
Yep.
and take it from them. Because they'll give it to you, because old people can't help but just want to share.
You pointed at me on that.
Terry stole my thunder. I was going to say, didn't you see how nicely this tied together? That the beginning of this conversation, you said, find someone, steal it, connect, mentor is important. And then Laura just said, the organization has to make the commitment and not just say that they're going to do it. They have to do things creatively and more to make sure it's happening. And then you have to do something. I have to give my 30-second commercial to the students. You heard something about we have more platforms now. We have more opportunities. You guys are training on that. You are showing us, when you're in your multimedia journalism class, when you're in working with HU News Service and you've got to shoot as well as you've got to do something for online, the more you know your craft, the more you build that, the more you let folks like this and elsewhere know, I'm here and I'm ready. And then also you bring that with you. So in parting, I want to thank the panel. I want to ask John to come back and say if he wants to say a few words before we go back and network. And then I'm going to go back to Terry, because he started us very nicely when he said, take advantage. You are in the room today with some wonderful people. And so when we go in the back, don't talk to all of us who you already know. That's what I learned when I got into business. Make sure you do not leave today without talking to someone in this room from these professions who you have never met before. Make sure they know your name and you know theirs before they leave. John, is there something you want to say in parting?
Thank you, and I don't want to delay getting us to this part back there, because I think what you just said is so important. Don't let us old people go back in the back and just talk to each other, because we will, because we've known each other a long time. come talk to us.
Not that long, I'm not that old.
He was a lot younger when I first met him. So the Pulitzer Center is about collaborating, it's about networking, it's about bringing together different institutions, journalists, news media outlets, universities, secondary schools. That's what we do. It's premised on the idea that we can solve these issues if we talk with each other. If we actually work together and we bring out the best in each of us, all of these, we have huge challenges right now, but if you're as old as I am, and you just watched 18 hours of the Vietnam War, which was the story of my youth, it's a stark reminder that as bad as things look right now, they've looked bad in the past. When I talk to my 93-year-old mother and talk about her experience growing up in the Depression and then having a world war that kills 70 million people in 6 years, we've had challenges, and it's not a steady progress. We're going to have setbacks. We're going to make progress. We're going to make further setbacks. But as long as we keep talking to each other and in good faith trying to find solutions, we'll be okay. But we need everybody in this room. We need this next generation to come up and seize the opportunities that I think all of us want to give you. So thank you, and good luck with everything you do.
Thank you.
And let us thank the panel again. And like I said, make sure you introduce yourself to someone. Thank you all.